Hey everyone, today's video I want to discuss skill-based matchmaking in Call of Duty. This isn't going to be a rant video, I'm going to be discussing the papers they published because personally this isn't a video I thought I would make. However, upon reading the paper I saw a lot of flaws, but initially before I read the paper I was watching like a lot of YouTube channels covering it, and I just heard like a lot of illiterate and conspiratorial things that just didn't make sense, and I still agree with that there is genuinely a lot of people that are very ignorant on how to read studies and data that just say ignorant things based on that data. So for example, one thing I hear is that, oh well, it was it happened during a bad time, of course people were leaving and yada yada yada, but they don't understand what cohorts are, where they basically take they have a control group, which is the normal matchmaking, and then they have another group, and they have them running concurrent with each other at the same time. So they're not comparing data at different time frames, they're comparing it between two different groups. So the data they're showing in that regard is correct. So that's one like false thing I hear about the negative, you know, the people have negative perception of this paper. With that being said, I'm not saying that the paper is all good. It's really not. Like, I have a list of issues with the paper, so and I want to discuss it, but I just want to say that I'm not discussing this from a conspiratorial perspective or anything. I actually do know how studies work. Um, I'm sort of a jack of all trades. I've Part of my game development career, I studied psychology, consumer psychology, and a part of that, just psychology, science, all that in general, is learning how to read scientific literature and and browse through it. So I did pick apart quite a lot of issues, and we're gonna discuss them. So, anyways, the first issue is that there's a limited time frame. So the study only provides a snapshot of data from about early 2024. I have another point in this list that it's going to elaborate on this, but I mean this we really could have used a longer study to see if this data has an equilibrium and flattens out, stabilizes. Because when you just have like an abrupt change like this, like you just adjust the skill rating and people are suddenly getting much harder matches or much easier matches, we don't know how long that adjustment period is and what it's going to be like. But you need a long-term study to show that the harm is actually this drastic. The harm could be either not as drastic, or it could actually be completely neutral after a certain period of time. This study was not conducted long enough to provide conclusive results. That's the first issue I saw. The second is a lack of peer review. So it was an internal study and it didn't undergo any independent peer review. They didn't have like a third party company or agency review their study. And this could lead to a bias, or they could overlook methodological errors. Now, obviously, bias is one of the next points I'm getting into, because the way they word the study, bias is apparent. So I can sort of see why they didn't have it peer reviewed, is because I think that they wanted to put their own spin on it. So the next point is selective data. So the study only focuses on positive outcomes of their system while not fully exploring negative scenarios, thus downplaying them. So the study is trying to prove that their system works rather than trying to figure out what works, and or if it's healthy for the player base, right? The study and ways that they do this is for one example, the study only shows graphs or raw numbers when it favors their viewpoint. Otherwise, it's briefly mentioned, then discarded. Like, they don't give raw numbers for the other scenarios. And so there's a lot of times where they reference like, oh, when we did this test, we saw this result, but then they don't show the data for it. I would really appreciate it if they would show all the data that they have, on confidential data, of course. There's also limited discussion of worst case scenarios or player experiences at the extreme ends of the distribution. Is there any way that we can make this fair for all players? Because obviously the top 10% of your players while being a minority of the player base, that is a very large portion of the player base, and that portion of the player base also happens to be the most dedicated of the player base in terms of most likely engagement and buying stuff and etc. etc. The last point is that the study is written with PR language, not in a scientific tone that's very neutral. Like it's very like PR heavy. Like again, I studied consumer psychology. I know the tricks that they're using and how they're wording things. They're trying to word it in the most convincing way possible. So they're trying to convince you of something, and I don't like that. I don't like the scientist in me does not like that they are wording it that way. And I know that this isn't like a scientific study. They're just publishing internal data in a certain format, and then they're putting a PR spin on it. So it's not going to have as much scrutiny. But I mean, still, if this is about transparency and trust, I don't think they should have taken the opportunity to do that. I think they should have handled it differently. The next is aggregation of data. The data is presented in aggregate form, so like how 95% of the player base is within 20 milliseconds of the best ping. There's a few issues with this. I didn't include one of them, but this may obscure important variations in individual player experiences. There's also another area. I probably should have combined them into one area, but in another section of this, I also talk about regional differences. So the data does show that, and while I have a issue with how the data is presented in aggregate form, it still may not be entirely wrong that most players do have good ping regardless of skill level. The problem is that most players are people like from the US, for example, where like no matter where you are, you're probably close, very close to a data center. But people in less populated regions like Australia, and if you're a high skill player in Australia, it'll literally put you in like across a full body of water, aka like an ocean, basically, to get you to the nearest server. So people in Australia that are like high skilled players, for example, may legitimately have like 200 ping. These are examples I've seen. There's been independent tests done on it. So skill level isn't the only thing that affects ping, it's also location. So those are two factors, right? If you're in a bad location, you might not have great ping anyways because you have limited data centers near you. And then you pair skill-based matchmaking with it when that skill is willing to sacrifice some ping for, competitive integrity. That is just going to be awful. So if you're experiencing negative results despite this data, it's most likely because of one of those two reasons: region or they need to present their data better. The definition of skill, the study does mention how they conduct skill to an extent. They talk about skill kills per minute, all this other stuff. I really appreciate it, but I wish they would define the actual word skill and what they mean by it. And I also wish they would talk about more about how they weight this stuff, because they said like for example, when they talk about being in a party with your friends, they don't really discuss exactly how that happens. I understand they don't want to reveal the secrets of their system, but it's kind of frustrating because this whole thing that they're doing here is a result of the community wanting transparency on it and having a lot of issues with this current system and how it is, right? That's why they did the study. So if they're doing the study for that reason, and one of the major complaints people make is that when I'm playing with my friends, they literally don't enjoy playing with me anymore like they used to back in the day because matches are too hard. They're not a good player, I'm a good player. And yet, despite that, back in the day with less skill-based matchmaking, or whatever matchmaking system you had, we were both able to have fun and play together, despite your claims that it's worse for bad players. And now that it's so strict, my friends don't even want to play the game with me. So, my social life is a little bit worse, and it's very unfun for both of us. That's anecdotal, of course, although a lot of people feel that way. But it's something that people feel, and they don't address that because they don't tell you how they weight it and exactly how their priorities lie. So they don't really make a comment on that, which kind of sucks. And also, they could have given absolute ping values as well, but they didn't do that. Now let's talk about the next one: limited discussion of trade-offs. While mentioned, there's limited in-depth analysis of the trade-offs between ping, skill, matchmaking, and wait times. So again, I already spoke about the waiting a little bit, how I wish they would go more in depth in the waiting. But of course, they don't want to reveal too much information, and they're also trying not to make the system look bad in any sort of way, like create any sort of controversies. Like they know for a fact that your skill is willing to sacrifice your ping. They're not hard locking you to a region no matter what, unless like your wait time is ridiculously long. But if they say that kind of abruptly, they know it'll be criticized, and this whole thing is supposed to be a PR spin. But I do wish they would go more in depth with it. And also, just speaking about the trade-offs, right? Because these systems have trade-offs to them. We all know that they do, but it's just not discussed enough. The next is a potential conflict of interest, which kind of goes back to selective data presentation, lack of peer review. But as an internal study by Activision, there's an inherent potential for bias towards positive findings. Of course, we know that. So a lack of comparative data. So this is where it gets interesting for me. The study doesn't compare Call of Duty's performance to industry standards or competitors. I'm okay with that, but I did want to include it. The study doesn't compare player experiences with and without SBMM. So it talks about reduced SBMM, but that would have been nice to see. They mention it, but they don't show anything about it. They didn't do this study in another COD game like Modern Warfare 2, for example, which has a lower skill ceiling. So you see how SBMM weights. So basically what I'm trying to say is that you should see how skill-based matchmaking weight affects a game based on its inherent skill ceiling, which would be more useful. So MW3 is regarded as having one of the highest due to having high mobility and a long time to kill, which when compounded with each other creates a ridiculously high skill ceiling for the average Call of Duty game, which is a worst case scenario for reducing skill-based matchmaking because games with higher skill ceilings tend to have higher, stricter skill-based matchmaking. So one example of this is when Advanced Warfare released the first game with exo movement. That was like one of the first games they increased skill-based matchmaking to separate the lobbies from people that knew how to use the exosuits and people that didn't. So I can't say there hasn't been any changes from COD 4 to Advanced Warfare, but all I'm saying is that when the Advanced Movement CODs came out, they made it a little stricter, and then they made it stricter again in MW 2019, I assume to account for crossplay and PC players, different inputs. I assume that's why they did it. But not every Call of Duty is the same. So doing this study across different Call of Duty games to finding optimal results for specific entries would be nice because, this game feels a lot sweatier than MW2, and I know they're using the same matchmaking. I mean, at least I think they are. They've never alluded that they use different matchmaking systems or values for different entries of the modern series. So this all makes it difficult to contextualize how good the reported metrics actually are. So regional disparities. While acknowledged, the study doesn't deeply explore solutions for regions with consistently poor experiences. I already covered on this earlier about the ping delta and stuff, so I won't get into that. So we're coming up on the last few. So player perception versus data. The study focuses on technical metrics but doesn't address player perceptions or satisfactions. The claim that removing skill-based matchmaking only helps the top 10% may be a misinterpretation of data, as it doesn't account for subjective player experiences. So what this means is, for example, they measure that that skill-based matchmaking is disliked. I mean, skill-based matchmaking being lessened is disliked and worse for the player base because more people left their matches. But there's a lot of things that they leave out or that they don't consider, either or. One of that is that, I've already spoken about the suddenty of just being thrown in harder matches, but if that's something that they're experiencing, then they're probably, just lobby shopping, and they probably do legitimately find easier lobbies. So like, you know, if it's lessened, it makes them more likely to get into harder matches, but also makes them more likely to get into easier matches because I assume when you lessen it, it widens it in both ranges, right? So you're also more likely to find worse players. And, if these people aren't used to these harder matches, it was just a sudden thing, they might lobby shop, they might actually find an easier match and actually easier than they did before. And everyone likes dominating a little bit here and there. So they might actually be enjoying themselves despite leaving. Like for example, that one mode with the small maps, Rustment or whatever, anytime people got Rust, they basically left the game to go find shipment. But that was still like a very beloved mode that people loved. Like people would have preferred just shipment, but if Rustment was just still in the game, people would still just be, playing that map just for shipment, right? But if they took that data and said people hate this mode, we're not going to bring it back. Look at how many people just quit. That would have been a poor extrapolation because they're not looking at the context. So yeah, it's understandable when your matches are harder, you tend to quit more often and lobby shop, especially when it's not something you're used to, which is why a longer term study was necessary. Transparency of algorithm. While some details are provided, the full matchmaking algorithm isn't disclosed, and this limits the ability to fully validate the claims made. I'm not going to fault them too much on that. I do feel like they held back way more than they had to, though. Like, I feel like they could have given more information without revealing all their secrets. Now, here are the last two addressing their past. The study makes claims that with the reduced skill-based matchmaking, only sweaty people would be left playing. But prior to Modern Warfare 2019, where the skill-based matchmaking wasn't as strict, this was never the case. This was never an issue. There's no evidence this has ever happened in a COD title before. Therefore, their claims contradict with their past, and we never see any data on this or proper address for how this is different. So we all have, most of us at least have probably been playing Call of Duty for well before Modern Warfare 2019, and we play in some of those games we even played for years after they came out. Like I remember playing Black Ops 2 up until Advanced Warfare came out, and Black Ops 3 up until freaking, Modern Warfare 2019 came out, and yet this just wasn't the case. It just wasn't the case. It doesn't happen. The only time this might happen is if the player population gets small just by proxy of the fact that hackers have overtaken the game, like the older Call of Duties, and the player population is reduced because it's very, very old. That has nothing to do with how casual the game is, though, or skill-based matchmaking, right? Because if you had skill-based matchmaking in a game with a population of 100, you either wouldn't find a match or it would just be redundant anyways. So it has nothing to do with that, and it just has to do with the very, very low population due to the age of the game and newer Call of Duties coming out. So this has never happened in a previous Call of Duty, and yet they claim this will happen. And they're saying it as very matter of fact, but all they have is just like data showing that people aren't returning to the game in a short time span. But you cannot extrapolate from that it's going to have this effect. You just can't. There's no way to do that. And it's even less believable when we have data from past Call of Duties that are technically long-term case studies, but we don't have the internal data to, but they do, showing that this isn't the case. So the last one is lack of long-term data. I've already said it before. The study doesn't show how skill-based matchmaking affects player experience over time. Long-term effects on skill development and player retention are not addressed. People might get better. I mean, yes, they did show that they let the match more. They did adjust this slightly, but it doesn't actually show anything about skill development over a long course of time. People suddenly experiencing harder matches may quit matches they're not used to it, but over time this population could stabilize. Given COD's pre-Modern Warfare 2019 titles, this is extremely likely. So yeah, this point right here that the population and would stabilize and retention would be fine is most likely true, just based off logic and Call of Duty's past titles. So these points don't mean that the study is entirely invalid, or even that the overall finding that skill-based matchmaking in its current form is the best thing for the game. I'm not trying to make any sort of comprehensive claim about whether or not skill-based matchmaking is good itself, or even just this implementation of it. It's just trying to highlight the problems with the studies, because many YouTubers that are highlighting the problems are just not being technical with it, and people that on the opposite side of the fence can easily dismiss it. And then there are some people that are being technical with it, but uh, they're not seeing all the issues. They're just seeing some of the issues. So I hope this is just a comprehensive video that helps everybody out. I'm not a big YouTuber, so this probably won't get a lot of views, but I just wanted to make a video on it. So, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, I guess. I don't know, but peace out. Thanks.